I've got a question. If you had to give up one of those senses, not the consciousness part, but one of those senses, the deafness, being deaf or being blind, losing either your sight or your hearing, what would be your decision? So how about a show of hands? Who would give up their eyesight? Who would give, okay, not unexpected back there. Who would give up their hearing? Well, there's been polls on this question, and the nature of the answers are kind of interesting. In the polls, the minority opted to be blind. And that was about the average here. They'd rather be blind than deaf, and about 6% of the people were indifferent, one way or the other. About 3/4 opted to lose their hearing, and those who opted for being blind placed a lot greater emphasis on aesthetic experience, particularly music. And that's why I was looking at Chris back there and his decision. A lot more weight on that than some of the practical challenges of being deaf or blind. It was not about the amount of time one spent listening to music, though. It was more about the extent to which one formally studied music and created music and played music and experienced intense emotions when you were engaged in music. Those opted for deafness, on the other hand, said, I would miss the many faces of my loved ones. I think we all agree on that. I could still drive. I need to see light and colors, and being deaf would be less debilitating for me, and being blind is being in darkness. Vision is more important in the day-to-day life, and of course seeing is believing. So nearly 80% of the information that the average person gets on an average day is taken in through the eyes. Now, that's not the case with my basset hound, because 80% of her information is taken in from her nose. She would easily give up her sight, and she already has lost one eye, in fact, or her hearing before that. But imagine if you were a hunter, okay? If you have to feed your family. Imagine you're in the forest and your eyes can only go so far as the next tree. But your ears, they listen for what you're hunting, and they listen sometimes for what's hunting you. Maybe the sounds of hooves, or the sound of a large body against a tree in the distance, or leaves rustling, grunts and growls, maybe a covey of birds that is disturbed and takes flight, a snort, a cough, even a vibration. The sound of silent snow falling, and then the crunch of feet in the snow. You have to be very quiet to be a successful hunter because of who's listening to your sounds as well, the sounds of the hunter. There's a fellow who's an author, and some of you may have heard of him. His name is Gordon Hempton, and he was the author of a book called The Last Quiet Places. It was featured on Krista Tippett's NPR show a number of years ago. Hempton made a point of searching out really quiet places where he could hear the presence of everything. The forest has incredible acoustics, like a cathedral almost. And he said, if I talk, I whisper, because quiet is quieting. Birds, wind, insects, fish, distant trumpeting of a male elk, it's all different at a distance. He spent a lot of time listening in those places and recording sounds. And he advised us not to listen, that he advised us that listening is not about focusing on a particular sound and blocking out the rest of the sounds. Listening is more if you're trying to tune into something and aware of the other things around you as well. Hempton focused on those natural places deep in the woods, but you can consider some of the things day to day in our workplace as well. And some of those sounds are worth considering. Chopping and spinning and click-clacking of typing and the whoosh of a forge or the chugging of a train. Those repetitive sounds, they're not mindless because they also inform us. And they can be satisfying too, so they're worth being conscious of. Now, any discussion of being deaf and being blind, you got to talk about Helen Keller, right? Yeah. And Helen Keller said, the problems of deafness are deeper and more complex, if not more important than those of blindness. Deafness means the loss of the most vital stimulus, the sound of the voice that brings language, sets thoughts astir, and keeps us in the intellectual company of men and women. Language is necessary to the development of the intellect. Language is the mind's opposable thumb. Very interesting. She was a wise woman. When you lose your vision, you lose contact with things. When you lose your hearing, you kind of lose contact with people. There's loneliness in silence and often disconnection. There's a tragedy in that. Now, my own experience in silence and darkness involved a lot of things, but exploring caves was one. Years ago, I dated a fellow who was a caver, a spelunker, but he called himself a caver. And to be in a relationship meant I needed to go into some caves. And so I did. I went into caves in Tennessee and Alabama, and I had a totally different perspective from that caving experience. I have never experienced darkness and silence more profound than in a cave. In a cave, the silence can be so intense, and the darkness can be so dark that it presses on your ears and your eyes. Some of you are shaking your heads. Some of you have been in caves. I'm talking about wild caves, not Carlsbad Caverns. I've been there too. It's a silence and a darkness as complete as nature can create. And some find it terrifying, while others find it a little different. They experience their deep soul connection. I know that he did in that environment. And I kind of experienced that too. But there came a day when I found myself in a cave, and I was walking along a ledge. This was not a cave I really wanted to be in. I'm walking on a ledge, and you have a light on a helmet here, and I tipped my light down, and it went down and down, and it swallowed the light. And I said, oh crap. Oh crap. It convinced me that my own meditation was much better done in a forest or in the cabin in my own woods. So I guess that answer to that very personal question, being blind or being deaf, is really depends on your perspective. And I bet that perspective changes with our life experiences and our age and our exposure, like in the cave, and our priorities, and the things that you think bring you joy. For instance, are you a musician or a painter, or both, in this case, Beth's case? Or do you like to ride motorcycles? You've got to have your eyes for that, right? So it's been said that silence, because sound and silence are together, is the creative ground for all music. I always have to bring it back to music a little bit because I am a musician. Ludwig van Beethoven, we all know him, and we all heard the fact that he was deaf. In his mid-30s, he began going deaf, and by the time he was 47 years old, he was stone deaf. Non-musicians find it next to impossible to imagine how a deaf composer can function. But with musicians of high order and perfect pitch, well, it's possible because deafness involves those external sounds, not the internal ones. And Beethoven, he was guided by the sounds in his inner ear. He couldn't hear those heavenly sounds that were being made with his own compositions when they were played. And that was really tragic. But when he conducted the orchestra, he used his eyes to understand. He would watch the violins and the other bone instruments and know whether they were on tempo or not, and he would guide it through that. And he insisted on doing his own conducting, even when he was stone deaf. And he was wild in his gestations when he did that. And this all through the other musicians off that he was trying to conduct. He wrote masterpieces when he was deaf. However, they were wild and huge and complex, and technically they were murderous. A lot of musicians couldn't even play it. Singers couldn't sing that high. There was a craziness that people perceived, and they assumed that he was crazy. That made him that way. But he was insistent, and he was defiant, and he was defined by his illness and his suffering and his musical genius to create music that transcended everything else. But he, like everybody else who loses one of those senses, he learned to use more of the senses that remained, and that's what he was doing, trying to cope. The fact is, I think all of us only use a very small portion of those senses of sight and hearing, and maybe some of the others for sure too. And the reason we only use a little bit could be because of distractions, or sometimes fear, sometimes what our focus is, or what our interests are, or our biases are. And so I'll tell you a story. About a dozen years ago, I was in Costa Rica for the first time. And one of the things I was really excited about, one of the highlights, was going to be taking a zip line through the rainforest. Now, I'm not terribly afraid of heights, but I was a little bit afraid of heights. And they rigged me up with these ropes and these harnesses. And they taught me they had gloves, and they taught me to hold the cable, and that was going to be how I would control my descent and my speed, so I wouldn't fly into the next tree. Or, on the other hand, I wouldn't get stuck in the middle. There was a trick to this. You had to kind of control it. And I was really focused. I was really focused on that. And the mechanics of staying alive at those heights. And at the end of my ride, my friend who was with me talked about seeing a giant sloth and a jaguar and baby monkeys and all these other wonderful things as she zip-lined through the rainforest. I didn't see a dang thing. I didn't have enough money to do it again. Some people have a real knack for seeing. And I have a friend, Honor Woodward. Some of you know her, have met her. She's a photographer. And she has a talent in being able to see the minute, small places in the ecosystems. And you can go onto her website or her Facebook and see the detail in a photograph that no one else can that I've met. I have another photographer friend, Peter McIntosh, and his photographs are very different. He has an uncanny ability to find the right light in a mountain vista or a waterfall. And they're both beautiful, but they're very different perspectives. And that's their style, and that's their vision. It's interesting how others of us can miss the obvious. 7 years ago, I had a close friend, and I bought this friend a dozen roses. Now, I wasn't going to be there for that special occasion, but I was working out of town. So I had the roses sent, and she said, check back, she said, beautiful. And a few days later, I came back, and I came to her home, and I saw the roses. And they were kind of interesting. A dozen long-stemmed red roses, a lot of greenery mixed in, and they had these 3 curly wooden sprigs coming up, sort of coming up to the heavens from them, reaching up through the flowers. But I noted that the flowers were kind of dying. They were dying really fast. And I observed to her how nice a job the florist had done. But I said, it's just not really worth it buying those cut flowers. And she didn't say anything, but I found out later it just made her a little sad for me to say it wasn't worth it. Well, you can't make up for those words, can you? Now flash forward 4 years later. I'm at the same friend's home, and I've been at this particular home 80 times, maybe 100 times in those 4 years. But this particular day, I took notice of a tree. Now this tree was near her heritage rose garden, right outside her door, and for some reason it stood out amongst the other plants in the trees. It sits there near the home, and its branches were dark and smooth, and they curled up to the sky, and the leaves were singular and perhaps a half or an inch in length, and they reminded me of a willow. It wasn't like just any willow. It wasn't common weeping willow for sure. And I was examining it, and I was touched by its beauty, and I went inside, and I asked my friend, I said, it sort of speaks to me, this tree. I don't even notice that I noticed it before. It sort of said, notice me. And I'm sure I've passed it many times. What is it? And she smiled, and she responded, it's a curly willow. Now, remember 4 years ago when you sent me those roses? They made me so happy, but when you saw that they were beginning to wane, you made that remark, and it made me sad. But later, when it was time to compost these flowers, I took them out and I saw that those little sprigs that curled up, they had some roots coming out. And I decided to take them root, and I did, and they got roots more, and then I planted them right there. And then in 4 years, they were taller than me. Just amazing. They're absolutely beautiful. And she said, I tended them for these 4 years. And I hoped that someday you would take a moment and look at it, and I could tell you that some things really are worth it, and some things really do last. It's a lesson. So visual consciousness is not my strong suit. I tend to be more of a listener. And musician friends and working with other musicians can just be a wonderful experience because musicians have that conversation, especially when you have other good musicians who know how to listen and feel the rhythms that you're sharing. A few years ago, I was privileged to perform at the Hambidge Center. I think at least one person was there, Jean, when I did this. I had gotten a call from Hambidge asking if I wouldn't mind playing with a dancer. This dancer, and she was also a choreographer, her name was Helen Hale. We spoke on the phone once, and she said, Marie, I want you to play cello, and I want you to play a lament. I don't care what lament you play, but I want you to play a lament, and then I'm going to come in and dance to it. And we never met until that morning, and we never rehearsed. Well, she had never heard me play before either. And so I sat in the room with people surrounding, sitting on the floor, many of them, and I started playing this lament. It's called Hurt. It was written back in the 80s by the group 9 Inch Nails. It's a beautiful piece. Now I can play, and she could dance beautifully. But I needed to be visually connected with her, and she needed to be connected with the rhythm and the feel of the music and the story that everything was going to tell together. She needed to be so very conscious of that rhythm and the dynamics and the flow. And without rehearsal, this could be some dangerous territory. And on top of that, we didn't know how long this was going to be. She didn't know how long the piece was going to be. I didn't know how to end it. And so we began with the audience surrounding us. And I played and she danced. And about halfway through, we began to kind of get into the sync together. It was almost like being in a trance with her. And when the time came to draw the performance to the end, we somehow knew it was right. We somehow knew. And the music of the cello easily melted the dancer into the floor. And we supported each other using those senses of sight and hearing and something else, being conscious. And the fact of the matter is that unless we practice consciousness, each one of us is essentially blind and partially deaf in this life. We miss a lot. We can't reach our potential. And we don't take notice. And we don't receive the pleasure either. So, my time is up for stories, and I want you, after, as we kind of gather for some food, to tell your own stories, because I bet this has brought to mind that. But I'm going to leave you with a short meditation on sound. I recorded some sounds, and what I'd like you to do is to let these sounds